In this video, we're doing another brewery one-on-one where I sit down and talk with Justin Kendall from Kendall Brewing. He's an avid home brewer and has been following the channel for a while, and in fact has actually come into Tanglefoot to have a beer with me. And so when he reached out a few weeks ago about doing one of these conversations, I was happy to do it. So we set up a time to sit down and talk about his idea of opening a brewery and the potential hurdles that he may face going into it. So without further ado, let's jump right into it and hear about Justin's story and his plans to open a small brewery in Wisconsin.
You know what? It's practice.
This is what idiot.
This is, you know what? It'll make me feel more relaxed because honestly, I've never done anything like this before.
Perfect.
So,
well, as you can tell, I am no technical savant. Welcome back. This is a little brewery one-on-one. This is Justin Kendall, and we just forgot to press record. So I'm going to go ahead and throw it back over to you. But go ahead and introduce yourself and maybe tell people how you found the channel and how you reached out to me on this.
Sure. My name is Justin Kendall. I'm the head brewer / home brewer for Kendall Brewing Company in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Been brewing for a little over 10 years now, and looking to hopefully take the step from home brewer to professional in the next couple of years. I found Andy and Tanglefoot on a trip last year down to Austin. My wife and I have always been big homebrew fans, big brewery fans. Whenever we travel, we always try and pick out different breweries that fit our tastes. I've always been a huge fan of lagers, always been a huge fan of Czech lagers. So came across Andy's place. I've been talking with him for, well, off and on for about a year now. Had the fortune of being able to visit and try his beers, fell in love with that. Reached out to him because I knew he was a home brewer at one point, and he took steps to working in a brewery and then opening his own spot. So I wanted to pick his brain and just find out what things I should be looking for and what things I maybe should avoid.
Sweet. That was great. So to kick this thing off, I guess I'll ask you, you sent over some questions that you had for me, but I'll go ahead and start with a couple of questions I have for you. So you're an avid home brewer, as it seems, behind you with all the equipment. Also, I don't know if I've really said this on the channel or any of these little vodcasts, but when I was home brewing, I only home brewed probably like 10 batches in my entire life. And so I got into home brewing and I did like an extract kit and then quickly was like, I want all grain, and got, kind of a janky homebrew setup off of Craigslist. But then I got into the beer industry so young that I only did like 10 batches. So my home brewing experience was super limited before I ended up going professional, which I thought was kind of interesting, because now I see all these homebrewers that have dope setups like you. They're just like, man, if I had that when I was homebrewing back in the day, I had like a trash can with like fiberglass insulation, and
I still have one of my first buckets from one of my first kits from Northern Brewer. I started just like everybody else. I always joke around, and you can make good beer on a janky setup. It's not the equipment that makes good beer.
Agreed.
It's the brewer, it's your process, and all these different things. Yes, I have cool stuff. I've been brewing for a long time. This has been my passion, my hobby for whatever. And this is one of the few things my wife lets me spend money on. Not unchecked, but she does understand that this is something and where I'd like to take this. But yeah, I've got my old fermenter's favorite, cooler in the background. I've got, when I started cold crashing stuff, I used to do swamp coolers, and I always feel like with anything you do, you have to be good before you can be great. I'm not saying I'm great in any way, shape, or form, but you always have to know the most rudimentary way of creation to really build upon that, because you can have all this cool equipment, and if a pump fails, I got to go back to gravity. If the electricity goes out, I gotta, haul up a thing outside and get the propane burner going. So it's always,
you gotta have the fundamentals.
Exactly. If you don't have that basic idea of how to do it, when you make a mistake, and it's going to happen, small scale, I've helped with some breweries and I've made some mistakes on big scale, nothing catastrophic, but yeah, that's why I always try to emphasize knowing the basics and, harnessing the fundamentals before you take the next step. But yeah, I've slowly but surely built up the way that I've done things.
Yeah.
And I could probably send you some pictures offline of just some of the setups I've had over the years, and janky would be a compliment.
Been there. Even on the professional system.
Yeah.
So you obviously got into home brewing and have been growing your expertise in that realm.
Mhm.
What has, well, I guess when did you get into home brewing? Circa what year? And then what is now interesting you to want to pursue it more professionally?
Sure. I got into homebrewing probably between 2012 and 2013. My wife actually bought me a kit. She actually the beer that got me into homebrewing was from Dogfish Head. It's called Midas Touch. And
Yeah,
it was
yeah.
an Egyptian-based recipe with muskrat grapes and a very unique, funky beer. I honestly didn't care for it, but it was just interesting to me that that's what you could do with beer. It wasn't your typical traditional mass-produced lager, pilsner, commercial beer. It was just something unique with that. And that's really what drove me into brewing is the idea of being able to make something not only that I like, but that I can share with other people. And what's kind of trajectory or the trajectory that I'm trying to take is the fact that it started as just a hobby and it grew into a passion and it grew into something more than it's just I like throwing back a brew with everybody else and enjoying myself, but I really like the fact of bringing people together and the social aspect of brewing. 2 summers ago, we had a pretty big party over here, and we went through probably 5 sixtels just on a Sunday afternoon with quite a few friends.
Nice.
But the coolest part about that is just the fact that everybody was enjoying themselves. Everybody was coming together for a light cause, conversation, and I want to take that feeling to the next level because I feel like with some breweries and some tap rooms, you go there and the atmosphere just isn't there. I want to have that experience on a bigger scale, and I want other people to share in that.
Okay, so that's great, and that kind of like primes the pump for questions later on. But
Sure.
in your, I guess now it's like 12, 10, 12 years of
Yeah,
home
about 12
brewing
years.
experience.
Yeah.
What are you, first of all, where are you from? Where do you live?
Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So a place that's never seen any breweries ever.
Mm-mm.
So yeah,
We're
just a
new to the
total
scene.
lack up there. Yeah.
Yeah.
So are you approaching, for two questions. One, are you approaching this as like, hey, I want to open a brew pub, or what type of business model? And then two, are you looking to fill a gap in the market, or are you specifically looking to start a like communal gathering space first and foremost, and then figure out the other stuff later?
A little bit of both. Could you refresh me on the first question? Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Do you have an idea of the business model that you're
Sure.
looking to do?
Yeah, we're definitely looking at more of the tap room on-premise production, a tap room for serving, and then on-site retail. Um, I I want to take it small, and we're also trying to figure out, and that's another reason I reached out to you, Andy, is to try and figure out how we can alleviate some of the risk financially. I would love to say I'm a spring chicken and I can take on risk and then I can bounce back financially. I do have a full-time job. I do have benefits. I do have a family. So I can't just throw all caution to the wind. Not saying that you've done that or other people have done that.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
but some people, it is a big step to take. It's not just something, you're going to take on. You're going to take on financial risk. You're going to take on loans, potential investors, a lease. There's a factor of multitude of things that I'm concerned about, and that's why I try to pick
Yeah.
as many people's brains as possible so we can build a business plan and grow this out. So the idea that we're looking at right now is to have a smaller footprint tap room. We're still figuring out a business plan in terms of location. We're a municipality that's outside of Milwaukee. It's Menominee Falls. It's a village in Wisconsin that's not too far out of Milwaukee. And there are no tap rooms in Menominee Falls. I do part-time bartend at a place sporting one of their shirts. It's called Three
Nice.
Cellars. And they are a craft brew, tap room, wine, a fantastic place. There is another place that's opening up, I believe, in June. It's a larger brewery from Milwaukee that's opening up what's called Inventors Brew Pub, or Innovation Brew Pub, sorry. And they're a Milwaukee brewery that's going to be opening up on just the corner of Menominee Falls, but there aren't any smaller tap rooms which have the kind of feel that I'm looking for. So in terms of, are we going to be, creating something new? I would like to think that we're building on things that have been successful. I don't know about reinventing the wheel. I would like to think that some of the recipes we do and some of the things and the vibe that we're going to be creating is going to be unique, but it is definitely going to be unique and something that is in need of in this area.
Cool. So yeah, you touched on the point that I was curious about, is there a glut or a lack of tap rooms specifically? So it seems
Yeah.
like there's a lack of tap rooms and a potential opportunity there.
Yep.
So are you you messaged me on Instagram before and you asked this question. I forget what video it was after, but
Yeah.
you reached out to me and you were like, "So is having good beer
Yep.
enough?"
Yep.
And I
Nope.
wanted to address that immediately, just
Yeah.
to kind of clear the air on that. And what I messaged you back is that in my humble opinion,
Yeah.
good beer is no longer enough of a differentiator because there's so
Mhm.
much great beer.
Yep.
And so that's one of those like bitter pills to swallow. If I were to have gone back, and it's not that I didn't know it, I did know it, but I kind of like I just kind of stuck my head in the sand. But like,
Yep.
and known what I know now 3 years ago before I started Tanglefoot, to know that just the beer, like the focus on the liquid, was
Mhm.
not as important as it used to be. It may have changed my perspective slightly
Yeah.
because I got into the industry, like I'm sure you got into homebrewing, and many people that watch this channel got into homebrewing for the creation of these interesting either combinations of flavors or executing classic styles really well, and just or putting your own spin on things. And that, in my opinion, is like fifth on the list of important factors when it
Sure.
comes to opening a brewery nowadays. So yeah, just go ahead and putting that out there to
Yep.
start the conversation with. So with the small tap room in mind, are you like what is your, I guess, rough timeline? Are you looking to open a brewery in the next year? Or are you looking like 5 years down the road?
We're looking potentially, it's going to be the plan that we're focusing on and we're trying to move forward in terms of the legal aspects and working with the TTB is delivering a business plan is within 2 years. We always had 2025 as kind of a roadmap date that we would like to hit. It's probably going to be sometime later in 2025, maybe early 2026. But I don't want that to be a sliding marker. I want to set a date for it and then try and establish it. And I think that's one of the reasons why I pulled back a little bit in terms of the scale of what we're looking to do. In terms of just a tap room, I'm not so concerned about distribution. I'm not so concerned about, are we going to have multiple locations? To be honest, I really don't care about that. I want to
Yeah,
be successful. And if growing pains are one of the pains we have to overcome, I'll be happy to, deal with those as it comes. If we get to a point where we're running out of beer because we can't keep up with demand and we need to build upon that, of course, we don't want to have shortcomings and not be able to serve people, but we want
it's a
to
good
build.
problem to have.
Of course, it's a
Yeah,
problem I'm more than, open arms have. But we also don't want to be short-sighted and start ourselves off too small. We're right out of the gates, we're underwater.
what's your definition of success with this business?
Um, Success is to be able to do this full time. I would love to be able to walk away from what I do as a career. I'm a network engineer, systems administrator. I've been doing that for well over 20 years. I consider myself to have a lot of success in it. I have a good salary, great benefits. But success would be is to be able to turn this passion of creating beer and sharing it with people is to be able to do this without any restraint, to not say, I can't brew today because tomorrow I got to work, to be able to do things on my terms. I would love to be my own boss.
Yeah,
And I'd love to say that I'd be my own boss, but technically my wife would be the owner of the brewery, so she could
yeah,
be my boss. But I just want to be able to do something on my own and do something that people enjoy and people
yeah.
seek out.
So does that mean? I mean, so to play devil's advocate, like you could snap your fingers and open a brewery. Well, it doesn't happen in a month or whatever, but you could
Mhm.
just open a brewery and be your own boss. But are
Sure.
you looking to like replace your income, or are you looking to just have something support your lifestyle, or
Yeah.
is it not financially based at all?
There has to be some financial metric to it. I mean, there has to be a level of, and that's the reason why I'm 43 years old and I've taken time to do this. I've been brewing since my early 30s. I knew that there had to be a succession of things. There had to be, creating beer, finding a process, understanding, scaling things. But money is unfortunately the key to a lot of things. So I would like to maintain our level of lifestyle, understand making some sacrifices, which we're totally willing to do. But I definitely don't want to jump in and then have my wife have to take on more of a financial load because this wasn't planned out properly. So risk assessment is a very big thing for me in everything I do. And I also have a little bit of a control aspect where it's like I'm creating this and I want it to be successful. So I always think of things to like the nth degree. If I do this and this happens, then I can counteract it by doing this. This chemical reaction in life. But we want to create a level of financial stability so that I'd be able to leave my job full time and be able to maintain a similar set of lifestyle, but doing something that I'm passionate about and I enjoy doing.
Cool. Well, then let's talk about some numbers then.
Yeah.
What size brewery are you envisioning?
I've talked to so many different people, and their biggest thing to me is they say, don't, right now I brew on a 10 gallon system. And I have friends that I brew on larger. So if I'm doing a larger scale, I'll brew on a friend's system, a 20 gallon system. I have friends that own breweries, so I can brew on larger scales with them, homebrew. Not for sale or anything like that. I originally thought about doing a nano system, but then I talked to more and more people, and they said the problem with that is then you're brewing all the time. And I don't want to be doing that because if you have a demand for something, I don't want to constantly be brewing one barrel at a time. So we had looked, and there's other breweries and other friends that have open breweries, and we'd be looking probably between the 3 and 5 barrel scale. Some have recommended to go larger than that, but then again, I feel if I go larger, I'm going against what I said and trying to alleviate some of the risk. So I think a 3 to 5 barrel system would be a good sweet spot. But I'm still picking people's brains and trying to figure out what the best option would be. But that's what I've narrowed it down to.
So let me walk you through my framework of how I kind of like approach this when I think, because I all the time think about like, how could I have started a better business or started a better brewery or whatever. So it's kind of like a snake eating its own tail where like you adjust one variable and then you kind of go back around and adjust another variable and that changes the outcome of that. But first and foremost, it's obviously the volume of beer that you're able to sell will determine your production needs, right? So like if you're assuming, hey, I have a demographic of this amount of people and I assume that I'm going to sell 200 barrels of beer a year or something small like that, right? Then that obviously drives like the system volume size that you're going to need to support that demand. But what I always like to point out when people talk about like opening these either a nano brewery or going bigger, like 10 or 20 barrels, is that it's all relative to the overhead of the business that you are operating in. So if you, because there's a lot of sentiment in the industry, like nano breweries cannot make money. And I would say as a blanket statement, if just as like a guideline, like if you're opening with a 1 barrel system, you won't make money. Just hard stop. Just there are some nuances in there, but just hard stop, 1 barrel, you won't make money. But if you have a 3 barrel system, which a lot of people were like, yeah, that's not enough beer to make any money with. If your overhead is $1,000 a month and you sell 300 barrels of beer a year, then you can theoretically make money with that. It's all relative to the location, your rent, your debt service, however much your equipment costs, unless you're paying cash for it. And so all of those factors kind of play a role in determining what will make a brewery profitable or not profitable. Like you could sell 1,000 barrels a year, but if you're rent 20 grand a month, you're going to have a hard time making it. So anyways, just having said all that, is there anything that you feel like is a blind spot in that equation? Do you think you have a good idea about like what rents are like in the area and what
Yeah.
like is it just going to be you and your wife running the business, or are you going to hire employees?
Yeah, I mean, the immediate idea is that it would be something that I would do, not moonlighting, but it would be something I would do around my current job. Is that I would,
Oh, okay.
something where I would basically be open like a Friday night, a Saturday, and a partial Sunday, just limited hour tap room, create a little bit of exclusivity, and just, test the waters a little bit. And that way, if things continue to grow, we can kind of scale the production, we can increase the hours and operation availability. The ideal, plan is to basically just be myself and my wife, and start it that way. That
Cool.
also determines kind of the scale of things. I can't do something massive because I don't want to take on a lot of debt. I don't want to have that as being, the biggest crutch is that we have too large of a location and we can't staff it. We can't serve people properly because if you don't have good service, you can have the best product in the world. Nobody's going to go there.
Yeah.
So taking those things into mind, but that's where a smaller, I don't want to say smaller because I don't want it to sound like degrading to what our plan is to have a more manageable and controllable setup so that it is something that we are starting with, but we know that there's the potential to grow into. So we have been looking at, and I always try to factor, and I've done this on the homebrew side, is I just try to figure out a cost per pour and what it costs me to make, including equipment costs, so that if I know what the operating cost for a location would be, what's the lease going to be? What's your electricity bill going to be? What's your water bill? All these different things that it's going to take this many beers to pour to maintain that cost. How many beers do I need to sell to do this, to keep the doors open? Of course, you want to exceed that and, make money. But trying to think of things, like I said, I try to think of everything to the nth degree. And I know I can't be in control of all factors. There's going to be rainy days that come up. There's going to be January here, notoriously in Wisconsin, breweries take a huge hit.
Yeah.
Everybody with their New Year's resolution and dry January and those different things. So I'm trying to look at everything. I know there's going to be things that I'm going to miss. And that's why I'm trying to pick people like your brain and other breweries and try and figure some of these things out so that we can draft a business plan that is good for what we envision the business to be for, I would say, a 1 to 3 year plan, and then potential growth, and that it can slide out, and be something that we can be successful in, and that we're not pigeonholing ourselves into, a small brewery that's not going to be profitable, because at the end of the day, we do need to make some money so we can continue to maintain the lifestyle, which is one of the goals, but to also be successful and have that, pain point of growth.
Yeah. Do you have an idea of what retail space rent looks like in your area?
We're trying to narrow that down. It has been difficult. Some of the places that we've been looking at have very long leases. So we don't want to get into something, once again, we don't want to get into something where we're just stuck in a space where either A, we can't afford it, or B, it's too small. And then we do have that point after 1 to 3 years where we want to grow out of that. So we need to have a little bit of wiggle room with that. But that's one of the things that we've been conscious about and we've been going back and forth on. And that's one of our biggest focal points, is because we can't submit a business plan unless we have a location. And then we can't obviously execute a business plan if we don't have a lease or something in place to say.
Who are you submitting the business plan to? Like banks for funding?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you have a rough idea of what you're like looking to get funded?
Not yet, because the scale of the brewery is kind of, we've been going back and forth on and flipping and flopping, and what scale do I want to go with. So once I pin that down, and then work more on some of the costs for leases and rents for locations, I think that those are the two big things that I think would really help shape what we'd be looking for in terms of funding.
Okay. And you said you're in what, Menominee
Falls.
Menominee Falls?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just looking up on LoopNet right now just to kind of get a rough idea. Yeah, not a ton of like retail spaces advertised, but
No.
I mean, definitely on the lower end of the range. Well, at least compared to
Yeah.
Austin, I guess everything is on the lower end of the thing.
Yeah.
But I'm seeing like $16 a square foot per year,
Mhm.
which is much significantly lower than what you would see
Yeah.
around here. But
Yeah.
so if you're looking at retail spaces, which I'm assuming you are because you're looking
Mhm.
to you're going to sell beer on site.
Yep.
I mean, I don't think you would need anything larger than like 2,000 square feet.
Yep.
Anything above that, you're just going to get into like much more overhead than you need. And if
Mhm.
it's just going to be like a two-person operation where you're brewing in one part of the air or one part of the building and then
Sure.
serving in like a small tap room, um, I mean, the more space you dedicate to the brewery, the less efficient it's going
Yeah.
to be because you want all of that space to be like retail where people can come in and sit down and drink beer.
Yep.
So that's like a rough, I don't know. I think that's like a rough square footage that I think I would at least kind of stick around or think about. But
Yep.
then I know it gets cold up there, but have you thought about you know, the type of location? Is it gonna like, are you looking to get like a standalone building with like an outdoor space where, families can hang out outside and do all
Yep.
that stuff? Or
And that's been part of the caveat. And then the space that you said in terms of square foot is kind of dead on. We've been trying to envision between 2,000 and 2,500 square feet total. So that
yeah,
we can have a dedicated area towards, the tap room and the dedicated areas towards the brewing, the fermenters, and all the fixed assets back there. But yeah, in Wisconsin, it's a premium to have an outdoor space because unfortunately we have such limited time that we can enjoy it. I mean,
yeah,
we've had a really nice spring here so far, so we'll see how summer goes. Um, but people up here are kind of crazy, even in the winter time, if it's cold, people will go outside. You see a lot of people with like solo stoves and things like that outside. So people will still enjoy an outdoor space, even if it's cold.
yeah.
So we are looking at something where we can have some amount of space outside. And that does limit because there are a lot of strip mall retail spaces that have popped up.
That's what I just saw. Yeah,
Yeah, and you
yeah,
see a lot of them pop up, and it's like there's a place out here called Pops, and in the strip mall there, it's like a frozen custard place. I'm like, that'd be kind of an interesting spot to have adjacent to them. But then you look at the square footage, it's a little lower, and then it's a parking lot in front, so you really can't execute anything if you were to want to have something outside without eliminating parking and dealing with restrictions based around that. So that has been definitely a difficult point is looking, oh, this space popped up, and we look at it, oh, square footage, it's affordable. Then you look, it's not big enough, and then it's in a strip mall. So a lot of strip malls. There's really not much industrial out in Menominee Falls. We would ideally like to have it out here to establish ourselves and to kind of build up this area and help bring other breweries, but hopefully to this area and kind of be the start of what good things could come. But that the space it potentially could push us outside of Menominee Falls, depending on what there is in terms of availability, cost, and what the goal is.
yeah. So if you're and did I just ask that? Like, do you have a budget for?
Not particularly, no.
Okay,
Not
I'm
to
just
say that there's
curious if you.
no, not to say that there's an empty wallet or or not an empty wallet, like an empty blank checkbook, kind of thing. But we do have some finances put away, some fluid things that we could put into it. So it would limit the amount of a loan that we would have to take. Um, I it's difficult. Do you want to look at the loans? Do you want to look at potential investors? I've had a lot of people who've reached out and say, hey, I want to support you, I want to do this. I don't know. I don't know much about taking on investors. I've never done anything like that. So I have a concern with having somebody else fund us.
Yeah,
Uh,
I've always been one. I've always been like super debt averse, but I've always been
yeah.
super averse to bringing on investors
Mhm.
because one, it's a bad investment. Like
Yeah.
there's if you unless you can guarantee, which if you can guarantee like what the revenue is going to be, then
Yeah.
you should be a millionaire anyways. You don't need investors, but
Yeah.
um, it's just having more hands in the pie is just, if that's an expression, is just like I think it ultimately can, I don't know. I feel personally that it just muddies the water,
Agreed.
especially if people are like investing for a return. But having said that, there are a lot of people that do have a lot of money that are just interested in like having businesses exist.
Yeah,
And I've been
sure.
around some of those where people are just like, we just want this place to exist, not necessarily looking for the return on the investment. But yeah, breweries are tough.
Yeah,
And, eking any sort of profit is already challenging enough. And trying to distribute profit is even more challenging. So I would just, take that for what it's worth. But
sure.
um,
And I'm
so
I'm I'm sorry to interrupt you, Andy. I'm very much you said about being debt adverse. That's one of the things that is the biggest cog for me and the caveat for me to take this forward is I'm trying to figure out ways that we can do this without taking on debt. Once again, talking about like the risk assessment and alleviating risk is I don't want to take on something. You never want to, I want to say we're going to be successful, but I know there is the chance that something can come up and it won't be a success. You never want to think that way, but you just have the reality of, shit happens, stuff happens. So looking at all those things, and that's where the difficult part is in saying, what is my budget or what do I want to do in terms of loan or the financial aspect is, I'd love to, have a crystal ball and say, this is how much we need, and this is what we're going to do, and this is the space. But as you know, it's such a fluid thing that it's very difficult to really assess. So I need to really try and focus on what are some of the main costs going to be that would be needed to get the ball rolling, and then figure out how is it going to be funded, and limiting some of those concerns or limiting some of those potential risks as I see them.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, the largest ones are obviously like equipment and build out, and then your overhead of the lease.
Yeah.
And so I mean, even if you just put a pen to paper and just come up with like, hey, if we go with a 3-barrel system, that's, let's say it's $150,000 or whatever it is for all the bells and whistles, and
Mhm.
then build out costs depending on what the location needs. I don't even know, $50,000, $100,000. And so if your whatever your theoretical revenue is doesn't work out with like a $300,000 bank loan, then
Yeah.
that's a tough one.
Yeah. So I switched over to a Mexican honey lager.
Oh, nice. I'm switching over to the
10
10
degree.
degree pale lager.
One of my next beers up to brew again is your 13 degree, because a lot of people really, really liked it. And yeah, a lot of people, it's funny here because a lot of people aren't familiar with dark lagers.
Yeah.
There's a couple breweries. There's a place called New Barons, which is a co-op brewery in downtown Milwaukee. And they
Oh,
switched
cool.
over maybe a year ago, maybe a little bit less. John switched over to doing all lagers, and had a lot of success with it. I think a lot of people don't understand the spectrum with lagers and how much you can really do.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Obviously, you know that. So
Yeah, it's coming around. More and more people are
yeah.
getting exposed to it. So you sent over a few questions. I don't know if you want to roll through some of those. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you probably touched on some of these, so obviously you can edit them out if we didn't. What are some of the biggest factors to consider before taking the leap from home to professional? But this might not apply to you as much because you said from a home brewer side, you only did about 10 batches. I mean, maybe you could just touch on, your introductory, phases or stages into the professional brewing world and then opening your own space. But like, what are some factors, probably touch on with finance, that you would say I should be mindful of?
Yeah. So with your situation, it's going to be unique because you're looking at opening a brewery of your own out of the gate. I always highly recommend that people go and work at a brewery before they do that. So I would recommend to you to go stage or hang out at the brewery and learn some technical professional brewing aspects. But outside of that, it's mostly just systems, systems and following the recipe. One thing that homebrewers are notoriously bad about is kind of like a pinch of this, a pinch of that,
Mhm.
similar to like home cooking. So that is just like following systems, replicating beers is super important. But
Sure.
then also one thing that I probably had the least amount of experience in when I started at the brewery was recipe formulation.
Okay.
So that was something that I had to get used to, because the difference between, you know, a 5-gallon batch and a 300-gallon batch is significant. It's not that like things don't scale, because they do scale, and there's recipe builders out there that help,
Mhm.
but knowing it, fine tuning the things. So your system will drive a lot of the nuances to the beers that you brew. So if you have a system that has a really vigorous boil on your homebrew system, but does not have quite as vigorous of a boil on your professional system, that's going to impact the flavor. If
Mhm.
your fermentation vessels are, if they have like a very like unique and um, specific geometry, like that can
Mhm.
affect the flavor from fermentation. That's on the small scale, it's probably not going to be an issue. But if
Yeah.
you like, you know, you ferment your beers in a one by one, um, you know, geometry of a fermentation vessel on a homebrew scale, but then you scale up to a 100-barrel fermentation vessel that's, you know, super tall, that can
Mhm.
increase like hydrostatic pressure and affect
Yep.
fermentation flavors. But on a small scale, probably not an issue. And then just being you know, diligent about all of the steps in the process, like taking gravity readings, taking readings of all the metrics in the process that you want to track and affect flavor, you know, tracking your pHs, tracking your
Yeah.
extraction, your boil volumes, hitting gravities, things like that. So, and then yeast management is definitely a big change from the homebrew scale, because at homebrew level, you know, you pay $7,
Yeah.
$8, you pitch a fresh pitch of yeast. That's cool. In a professional setting, that is a great way to not make money.
Yeah.
So that's another element. And then also, I didn't even think, this is just coming to me. I didn't think about this when I read your question, but beer dispense. So actually serving beer is a
Yeah.
huge part of running a brewery,
Mhm.
because managing carbonation levels in beer and making sure that your draft system is built out appropriately, so that the beer that you carbonated to this perfect degree is served at the same carbonation level,
Sure.
and making sure that your like it's very complex, and it's actually, I kind of nerd out on it. I really enjoy the kind of physics of all the draft systems, but it can
Yeah.
be pretty like fickle,
Yeah.
and you can have too much pressure in line so that your beer doesn't pour with foam, or too little pressure so that
Oh, yeah.
anything above 2.4 volumes will pour like a, you know, just all foam. So
Sure.
that's another nuanced aspect of it.
Mhm. Yeah, and touching on some of that, you had mentioned about working at a brewery. I did work at a brewery for about a year, a
Mm,
10-barrel brew house. Was more on the front end of things. Was able to brew, you know, some things, but yeah, we brewed, you know, actually at 10-barrel, you know, 10-barrel batches. I've also worked with a couple breweries and done on the smaller side, 3-barrel batches. So I have had some experience there. Some things I'd like to learn more about is the final, you know, the cellar side, in
yeah.
terms of, like you said, the carbonation. On the homebrew side is can't really measure the carbonation. You know, you kind of
Yep.
carbonate, taste. And one prior example, or one current example, was the overcarbing of the hop water. Overcarbed it and then had to bleed it off, and then had to figure out the tap system for the lines that we ran here to serve properly, to create the right level of restriction on the line to do it. So that's one thing I want to get better at, because doing a 5-10 gallon batch of hot water is much different than, like you said, having something that's got long lines that are run. It's coming out the tap properly. So that's one of the things I want to better understand, is the finishing of the product and how the product is represented when it's served. So definitely something I need to learn more about, and I'd like to get more experience on a larger scale.
Yeah.
So, what is something you wish you knew before you opened your tap room?
I wish I knew what the sales were going to be. I wish I knew how slow it was going to be frank.
Yeah.
Um, and um, I here's the thing is, and I'm sure this is the same for you and the same for most people that start a brewery, is that I knew a lot of the issues with breweries before I opened up a brewery.
Mhm.
Um, and I never wanted to open a brewery from the ground up, because I know how difficult of a business it is, and the economics of it are um,
You're
can be
really
very
making me feel good
challenging.
about this. You're really making me feel
No,
positive.
hey man, that's what this is all about. I mean, you
Yeah.
should know. But
No, I agree.
I never wanted to do it because I didn't think I was, or I didn't think I wasn't comfortable with the financial risk
Sure.
for hoping that it would work out. And
Yeah.
so that's why I opened the way that I did, where I took advantage of a very small
Yeah.
opportunity that I only had to spend a few $1,000s to get up and running, and then
Hmm.
slowly kind of tried to grow it from there. But nowadays, after being in it for 3 years, things have changed so much, and my own perspective on the beer industry has changed so much. I'm pretty jaded and cynical at this point. Just it's kind of my disposition.
Sure.
But what beer was 10 years ago is no longer what beer is.
Mm.
And I got into beer in that time period and was very excited about it. And that is
Hmm.
no longer, in my opinion, a viable business option
Sure.
to say, hey, I just want to make great beer.
Yep.
And so you have to swallow that bitter pill of accepting that making great beer is not the business. The
Yep.
business is having a events space, a gathering space that has food, that has entertainment, that
Yep.
has a hospitable environment that's family friendly. And if you check off those boxes, then you get down to the like, and also we're going to make great beer.
Yep.
So if you can stomach that, which I'm
Yep.
kind of going through a phase where like I'm not sure I want that, and
Yeah.
so um, if you can stomach that and you're okay with operating what essentially works out to be like a bar, right, like a
Hmm.
taproom bar, then I think you have a huge leg up because a lot of this journey is, for me at least, has been more emotional because I was so passionate about beer that
Yeah.
when you learn like, hey, your passion isn't enough, it's really like you need to make good business decisions, and good business decisions in this industry are have trivia on Tuesday nights, get people through the
Yep.
door with things that have nothing to do with beer.
Sure.
And I just personally have not wanted to go down that path because if I'm going to do that much hard work, I'd rather make more money.
Yeah.
If I'm
No, of
being
course.
honest.
No,
Yeah.
yeah, and that was a great point, and I asked you that question, obviously in email. I think it was a couple months ago, when you had posted a video about some of the struggles you were facing in terms of the location where you're an hour away from where you live. So
Yeah.
that on top of other things and business being slow and those things to overcome. I don't have this question written down, but are you still struggling with some of those things? Are you finding ways to overcome some of those obstacles, or where's your mind space at now from where you
My,
were at
my
when you posted that video?
No, yeah, my mind space is not great. I've not overcome those challenges.
Yeah.
I don't I don't envision myself continuing this, if I'm being
Yeah.
honest.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of factors involved, but specifically, one of the biggest ones is like I don't. I thought that I could overcome the struggles of running a business an hour away, and it's
Yeah.
not the drive time. It's not all. It's just if you're going to sacrifice and try to build this like communal gathering space, I'd rather it be in my backyard.
Yeah.
And so that's like a big challenge of what I chose to do. But then again, I couldn't have opened a brewery in this capacity in
Yeah.
Austin for the overhead that I have. Like
For
it
sure.
wouldn't have been possible. So
Yeah.
you take the good with the bad on that. But
Yeah, of course.
yeah, just being comfortable. Like it again, I want to drill home like things will be tough. Like it will
Yeah.
be a struggle no matter what you do. Like you could be busy out of the gates and it can still be a struggle.
Yeah.
But having a place where you're like, I want to be here is a
Yeah.
big part of it. Like just
Yeah.
I want to go to this brewery and build this thing because I need this thing to exist is a huge part of it.
Yeah. And I don't want to be cliche and have like the field of dreams kind of thing. If you build it, they will come. That's one of the reasons why we want to have something out here in Menominee Falls, is the fact that there is nothing. And we feel that if you have an environment and you have a good product and you have a great atmosphere, that people are going to come. And then other people are going to potentially want to open up. There have been talks about other breweries opening up in this area. And I do feel to a degree that the more boats in the ocean, the higher the tide. I'm not saying oversaturate the market in this area, but when you go to, it's not as common, from the brewery scene, the craft beer scene. 10 years ago, there weren't as many places. You'd go to a place, you'd spend 4 or 5 hours there. You'd spend your entire day. Now you go to a place, you have the staple beer that they have, or with one of the seasonal beers, and then you go to the next place and you try. Milwaukee is notorious for that. It's very
Yep.
rare that somebody stays at a brewery for an extended period of time.
Yes.
So to understand, sorry, go ahead, Andy.
Let me push back on this a little bit because
Yeah.
I want to transfer as much of this as I can
Yeah,
to you.
for sure.
If you build it, they will come is not necessarily true. And if
Sure.
you open a business and you're like, I'm doing this great thing and nobody shows up, how are you
Yeah.
going to deal with that?
Yeah.
Two, the modern craft brewery is the taproom beer model. Like
Yeah.
if you started this conversation and said I want to open a 10,000 barrel a year distribution brewery, I'd say just hard stop, don't do it.
Yeah.
But that's the model that it kind of has a chance of succeeding.
Yeah.
You're not competing with other breweries. You're competing with every bar, restaurant, and
Sure.
other entertainment venue that serves alcohol.
Yep.
And again, another one of those pills that you have to swallow and be like, if you accept that and you're like, this is
Yeah.
no longer just the breweries game where people are coming out to just breweries, you have a huge leg up because then you can say, you know what, we're going to have the farmers market, we're going to do these
Yep.
things, all these other ancillary events that have nothing to do with beer, but
Yep.
they come and then they happen to drink your beer.
For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Also having products too, it is going to be beer focused. I don't have any desire to get into a wine license. I don't want to do hard ciders. I do dabble and I've got a hard cider fermenting over here just as a little project on the side, but I don't have the desire to go anything outside of beer. So beer will be the focus. It will be a brewery. It will be a tap room, but I do fully understand that there has to be more to it. 10 years ago, there were breweries in Milwaukee where they would have hot yoga. They would have goat yoga. They would have all these things. And at first I'm like, why are they doing this? And then you realize, okay, it's to draw people in. It's to have more than just it be go and get a beer. People want to have a big thing here is food trucks. Have a lot of food trucks. You don't have to have a dedicated kitchen, but have a couple dedicated parking spots where you have food trucks. But then I also think to the nth degree of that is, unfortunately, sometimes food trucks might not be available. They might have a flat tire. They might not be able to show up. So what do you do?
Did you watch my last video? Is that why you brought that up?
I did, but I had a friend, another friend who had a Cinco de Mayo thing at their brewery, and their taco truck couldn't show up. I don't know what the situation was, but they're putting out feelers and on Facebook and LinkedIn or not LinkedIn, Instagram, like, hey, can anybody come and help me out? And can we do something? So realizing that even though you own a business and as much as you want to be in control of everything, you don't control everything. And I've come to realize that, that I can control so much. I can create a product and, I can do these things, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to lead to success. There has to be a lot to it. We're in such like a postmodern world that we live in that it isn't just about this one thing. It's about these 5 or 10 different things. So, but just trying to put those 5 or 10 different things together that lead to success.
So I'll give you another nugget that I'll probably have to clip this. So this is something that I've talked about with pretty much every brewery employee, owner, whatever that I've talked to in the last year or two. If I were to start another brewery, which I'm not really interested in, but if I were to start another brewery and I look around at what is successful, these are the factors that I would recommend for somebody to do if they were to start it.
Sure.
Pick a great location. Great location is subjective to the city that you're in, but having foot traffic, having parking, having the outdoor space, having all that, having a large enough seating capacity and for large groups of people to come.
Sure.
2, obviously make great beer. That's that shouldn't even be on the list. That's just like a given.
Let's do it.
Make great beer, but have a variety of beer and seltzer and all that stuff. Serve the wine, serve the liquor, have food, whether it's food trucks or on-site kitchen.
Yeah.
And schedule out of the gate, have an events planner, an events coordinator.
Yep. Yeah. I've definitely seen that. Like, there's a place out in Waukesha, my friend Ethan opened up, and they've been open for 2 months. Every week you see a list of events, different food, different things that are drawing people in, and they've been packed. And you hope that it's not just I don't know what the term you want to use is, the initial right out of the gates, everybody wants to support them and sense of community and let's go, you hope it's maintained and it's sustainable. But yeah, definitely I've learned that you know, it's not just about one factor, but having a multitude of things that are going to draw people in. And also even having, I feel like having consistent beers, there's so many places, I'm probably going off on a tangent, so edit as you need, is that I'm a very traditionalist when it comes to certain style of beers. I know there's a lot of people, even in, you know, our area, that come in and first thing to say, and I know from working at breweries and working at a bar and serving, is so many people come into a craft brewery, the husband and wife, and the wife says, you know, what's the closest thing you have to Bud Light? What's the closest thing you have to this? And that's not a knock to the craft beer scene. It's just, I always say, like what you drink and drink what you like. So having something that I might not necessarily think is unique or, you know, this biggest thing, but making, you know, this beer, the Mexican honey lager, isn't my favorite beer in the world, but I've brewed it and I've started to appreciate it and know if I just want a light, good drinking beer, but I know I put a lot of effort into this beer and I made a really good product, and that it can be something that people who might not necessarily be craft beer drinkers, that they're going to enjoy. One of the best pieces of advice that I've gotten from one of the biggest breweries here in Wisconsin, it's called Eagle Park, is they said, understand that if you're going to open a brewery, you're not brewing for yourself or your tastes. You're brewing for what the market dictates. You're brewing for what consumers want. You can brew the best beer in the world, but if that's not what the palate is for the people, it isn't going to sell. So understand that you know, that hazy craze or double dry hop or peanut butter and jelly sour might be a thing. If you're not following some of those beers and at least having some examples of some of those things, that it could potentially be detrimental.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's, I mean, you can also like, yeah, I go off on a tangent about that, but like chasing
Sure.
styles and stuff is also kind of a, you know, like figuring out if you're opening a brewery just for beer, like specifically to build a brand in beer, like find an identity and stick with it has
Yeah.
always been like, you know,
Yeah.
or stick with it. And if it doesn't work, then pivot and find another identity.
Sure.
But apply that same reasoning of like, yeah, you've got to give people what they want to all the other aspects of the business.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess that kind of leads into the next question I have. You know, do you feel at all limited focusing on one style of beer and just only Czech lagers?
Yeah,
You know,
absolutely.
and you know, in terms of, I mean, because obviously they're phenomenal beers, but you know, are there other things outside of that? But since you already kind of focused on the identity of being a Czech lager brewery, do you feel that that's kind of a limiting factor for you?
Well, it is, but not in the way that I think you're meaning.
Okay.
It's limiting inherently because it is so limited. It's very,
Yeah.
very, very niche. But the
Sure.
goal was to do that, was to be very, very, very niche
Yeah.
and execute these styles at the best examples in the
Sure.
state. Um,
And I
but I
didn't I
think
didn't mean that as like a negative thing. I just didn't know if you
no,
felt.
I
Okay.
understand. But
Okay.
I think the root of that question, because I get that question a lot, but I think the
Yeah.
root of the question is always in, don't you want to brew other stuff? Like, don't you
Yeah.
feel like you want to brew an IPA, or could you brew an IPA?
Yeah.
I did that. I've done
Yeah.
it. I've
Yep.
brewed every style you can imagine at the previous place I worked. So I scratched that itch of like
Sure.
uh, innovative beer recipe building and doing
Yeah.
fun stuff and using all the fruits. So I got to scratch that creative itch as like as a brewer.
Sure.
And this was specifically to try to like build a brand around these beers. But the answer to your question is yes, it's inherently limiting. It limits the obviously the audience that wants to come in for these specific beers. It limits the sales that I make per person when they come in, because there isn't the wine, there isn't the seltzer, there isn't the
Sure.
IPA or whatever. And then there's several other factors that I do in my business that I wouldn't recommend anybody else do from a business standpoint, but I
Yeah.
did them purely out of like pride.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so yes is the short answer.
Okay. You had mentioned in the past videos that you dealt with the licensing, you know, in terms of doing a lot of things on your own, in terms of liquor licensing. I'm not sure what you know, if it's the same level of like taproom laws or, you know, the tier that you decided to establish. You said you did a lot of the paperwork, and I believe one of your videos you know, showed kind of the steps of doing it on your own. Do you still suggest doing that, or would you recommend, you know, having a lawyer that's familiar with the laws help with some of those things?
I don't think on the like for the licensing aspect, it may be different in Wisconsin, but like the just getting the licensing done through like TTB and TABC was pretty straightforward. Like it's
Okay.
just personal and business information. Like I mean, I'm sure maybe there's some nuances. I think if you're a small operation, it's not that big of a deal. If you're a larger operation, maybe you need to uh, cover your ass by making sure, like, if you have a bunch of investors, you have to, at least in
Yeah.
Texas, you have to report ownership information, and that can be pretty invasive and annoying.
Sure.
So in that regard, it could be more complex. But on the just the licensing aspect, I don't think so. But you there's a lot of areas in this industry where having a lawyer is beneficial.
Yeah.
Um, and like compliance stuff and making sure that you're adhering to local alcohol regulations and things like that. It could be beneficial. Luckily, I'm a part of I was at Black Star and still am actually, but was a part of the Texas Craft Brewers Guild that has been like an endless amount of helpful information. And so there's a lot of like communal resources that can
Sure.
help you get through it. But having said all that, pretty much, I mean, there's a couple of breweries that are larger and started with like larger budgets and stuff that definitely have like lawyers on retainers, but all of the small guys, like they did that shit themselves.
Yeah. And that's kind of the factor too, is just trying to, I guess I say a lot of these things in terms of developing a business plan, licensing, financing. That's where I need to kind of, I think, become a little bit more focused in terms of what are the things I need to check off to make this happen. And I think that's where I have a little bit of apprehension, is because I can unfortunately sometimes be a little bit scattered, and trying to focus it in, and like, okay, if I have a deadline of this or a time frame of this, I shouldn't say deadline. What are the things that I should accomplish, and what are the things that need to be prioritized? So that's one of the things I feel like I need to work on if I want to make this come to fruition.
Yeah, I mean, and depending on the scope of the project, I mean, branding's a big deal,
Yeah.
or can be. If you're looking at having, if you're expecting the business to grow and be quite successful, getting branding done out of the gate is always nice. I mean, there's plenty of examples of breweries that just kind of have, hand, done logos on Illustrator and stuff. Like, I mean, I
Yeah.
did my logo, but I think it's
Yeah.
pretty nice.
Yeah.
But
I
I
agree.
have a little experience with that. But
Sure.
yeah, so some branding stuff, and then kind of i- i- there's more like graphic design and stuff involved with like packaging, cans and stuff like that. But then from the business standpoint, yeah, at some point, I totally empathize with your over
Mhm.
analysis, because I tend to get that way too.
Yeah.
And so, but you can easily be in this like analysis paralysis where you're like,
Yep.
oh, everything needs to be exactly perfect. At
Yep.
the end of the day, you need to find a location, you need to buy the equipment, you need to build out the brewery, you need to get the licenses, and
Yep.
you need to brew the beers and open. And
Yeah.
so that's the and that timeline alone could be, I don't know, a year or two,
Yeah.
depending.
And especially with the fact of general contractors, having an ideal space, but then building out, having, if you want to have floor drainage, if you want to have all these, different, I've been to enough breweries, and I've, worked with enough brewers and head brewers and owners of places, and I always pick their brains, and every place is unique and every place is different, and they all have, we wish we would have done this, we wish we'd have done that. And I take that and I'm like, oh, I can make the perfect brewery right out of the gates. I know it's not going to happen.
No, because then you'll do all those things and you'll rack
Mhm.
up the bill for all of those things, and
Yeah.
you'll be like, shit, I should have
Uh-huh.
just shoestring budget it and
Yep.
opened and had cash flow.
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of people look at, some of the homebrew equipment I have been saying, oh, well, you're going to want to shoot for the stars. I'm like, that's not realistic. If I had all the money in the world, or if I had, a couple $1 million I'd be sitting on, I guarantee you I wouldn't be waiting to pull the trigger on some of these things.
Yeah,
Um,
and yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I think when people are like, yeah, if I had $1 million to open a brewery, blah blah, I'd do this. Be like, dude, just put that in the S&P.
I wouldn't, yeah. I've got enough,
Just
yeah,
put
I've got
that in
money
the
market
stock
accounts.
market.
I'm like, yeah, money
Yeah,
market accounts, drop the money in there. I wouldn't, honestly, if I had $1 million, multiple $1 million, I wouldn't be opening a brewery. I'd invest in a brewery that's larger, that's scale, that I could maybe make some money off of. But yeah, I wouldn't,
yeah.
the dream, it is a dream. The dream is to open a place that, I'm
So I
proud
have a
of.
question for you.
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh,
It's
go ahead.
but and I think about this because when I lament the fact that like my business isn't as successful as it, as I expected it to be and whatever.
Sure.
And I'm now at a point where like I need to start making money. And so maybe that
Yeah.
means I get a job or whatever. Everybody's like, oh, you should do consulting. You should do consulting.
Mhm.
And so, and then my response is always, well, my consulting is pretty much like this, where I'm like,
Yeah.
yeah, maybe you shouldn't open a brewery.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
maybe you should if you have a bunch of money, but maybe you shouldn't if you're
Yeah.
looking for a financial return.
Sure.
But I always come back to this question. What is the driving force for you to open a brewery? Like, what is the goal? What is your absolute, like, the ideal outcome from opening a brewery? Is it just being able to produce beer professionally that you can
Mhm.
sell to people, or is it something else?
That's part of it. I'm also a very, very old school traditionalist when it comes to business. And that's one of the reasons why I chose Kendall Brewing Company as the name. All original and all breweries in the United States, most of them when they originally opened behind the, your name.
Yeah.
Miller Coors, all these different places open behind that. So I feel like I want to produce a product. I want it to be something that's memorable, and I want it to be something, there's some longevity to it. There's something more. It's not just going to be me opening a tap room and it being known as just a tap room. That there is something that is memorable. I don't want to say legacy-esque because I talked about how I don't necessarily want to do distribution, but I want to be kind of a pillar in our community, and I want to bring brewing back to this area. There was only one brewery that I can recall in the past 10 years that's been out here, and the history of brewing in Menominee Falls has been fairly non-existent. And I think that there are a lot of negative connotations that go along with alcohol. And I want it to be something where there's a line of like heritage to it, that they see Kendall Brewing Company and the person and name behind this place helped bring brewing back to this. I don't want to be a pioneer, or I'm bringing this to the forefront, but I feel like with beer and the social aspect of the communal sense of what brewing has done for not only the state of Wisconsin but for the country, that there are a lot of positives that can come from it, and I would like to see some of that come to this community in this area. So not only making money but establishing ourselves as someone in this community and bringing others in the beer community back to the forefront, and understanding that there is a lot more to beer than just beer, if that
Well,
makes sense.
yeah, absolutely.
But that's a lot of people say, why would you want to open a brewery with your name? What if it's not successful? Then people are going to say Kendall, your name Kendall is synonymous with a failed brewery. And I said, I don't look at it that way. I don't look at it as us not being successful. I put my name behind it because I truly am passionate about beer and what it presents. And I know that might, it might not mean a lot to some people, but it is a strong sense of honestly who I am. It's a strong sense of growing up, and some of the best social gatherings I had with family was around hams. The
Yeah.
hams bear back in the day. And I remember one of the first hats I had, my grandpa used to drink hams and used to be able to trade in the UPCs and get points, and I had a hams bear winter hat when I was like 5 or 6 years old. And I didn't look at that as, alcohol and somebody being drunk. I was a young kid and I thought it was a cool logo. So I like the outcome and the positive things that beer and brewing and socializing can mean. It doesn't just mean an alcoholic beverage. It means so much more than that. And I would like to see more of that in this area. And I would like to help bring that back to this community. So
Awesome.
that's part of the goal and part of the vision. Yeah, I want to make money, but that's not at the forefront. That's not,
That's good. Yeah.
you always say to, people say, if you love what you do, you don't work a lot. And for the past couple of years, I say to people, but shit, I've been working a lot, and you don't see a lot of return on that. And, some of the things I enjoy doing in my career and some of the things I don't enjoy doing. But I do believe that you can take something that you're passionate about and it can be successful. But it's just trying to figure that out, and the finance aspect of it too. How can I make that a
Yeah.
reality is the biggest struggle.
Yeah, for sure. No, those are all great reasons. I like that.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's been long overdue, I think, in a lot of places where, whenever we travel and go into your place, and there were other breweries that we were to in the Austin area, every place we travel, we seek out different breweries and different styles of different things. And you go there, and I always liked my wife's social. I'm more social than her. But I like to belly up to the bar, and hopefully I run into a brewer or I run into the owner, and you just talk to them and you see the different people about them and what do they envision. And more often than not, a lot of the brewers, and the owners aren't saying, I want to make money. They often come back to saying, I want to bring people together, which ultimately does lead to money. But I don't think that's the first and foremost thought that a lot of people that they're gravitate towards. So I understand that potentially opening a brewery isn't going to lead to these great financial gains, but I think that there's more to it than that. And I feel that success isn't driven by finance. Not saying I want to lose money, because obviously that can't be
No.
the end result. You gotta make money to reinvest in yourself and reinvest in your goal. But I do feel that the social aspect and the cultural aspect of beer needs to be more focused on.
For sure. Agreed.
All right, so maybe just a personal question, but outside of Czech lagers, what are some of your favorite beers or styles?
German lagers. I had that loaded.
Czech lager, Austrian lager.
No, I mean, I am definitely a beer nerd at heart.
Yeah.
Pale ale is is kind of the quintessential craft beer for me.
Sure.
But outside of that, I don't often seek out craft beer anymore after, being in the industry for so long and owning a brewery. These beers happen to be the style that I most gravitate towards, but
Sure.
I've always really loved imperial stouts. I've always really loved, although I can't drink them often, but I used to really like Belgian beers. I used to love quads.
Yeah.
And then I do love mixed culture beers as well. So just really nice nuance beers with a little bit of acidity is definitely right within my wheelhouse.
Yeah, I've really been focusing on, I love doing lagers. So I do Mexican honey lagers. I've done some of your recipes. I love doing just off the cuff, very traditional styles. Like one of my most popular beers that I get a lot of feedback on is the Crystal Weizen. So just a filtered hef, which a lot of people really enjoy it. And I've always really liked wheated beers. As I've gotten older, wheat beers don't really agree with me as much. But it's been a very popular style that I've really enjoyed doing. I don't tend to do a lot of big beers. Anything over, I think the biggest beer I have right now on tap is a Maibach, and it's a little over 7%. But I like table and session beers, because once again, going back to the social aspect of the people being able to have the ability to come together and drink and have more than one, or not, get knocked on their ass by one big boozy beer. So I like to have things that are a little bit more approachable. I hate the words. There's a lot of terms that people in the brewery industry out here, and I joke around with. I can't stand the word chuggable. I don't think beer should be chugged. I think it should be enjoyed. It's always been a big thing. Oh, a lawnmower beer, a chuggable. And I have people who say, "Oh, do you got any chuggables on tap?" I said, "No, I've got some you can enjoy though."
Yeah, crushable, maybe chuggable. That's a little
there's
lowbrow.
chuggable, there's crushable. I always joke around. I say I'm going to make the most hipster beer ever. That's chuggable, crushable, super triple quad, imperial IPA, hazy, lactose
Seltzer.
So, I do some seltzers too. That's one thing I've been working on a lot. There's a brewery in Denver, downtown Denver, called 14er. And they had a bunch of really cool horizontal serving tanks. It's in Lodo, so lower downtown. 14er. It's based off the 14 highest peaks in the world. Yeah, 14 ER, 14er.
Interesting.
14er. Yeah, 14er is the place. I could shoot you a link for them. But yeah, they have a bunch of horizontal, I think there were 10-barrel horizontal serving tanks. And this had to be 4, 5, 6 years ago, maybe even longer. And I was talking to them and I was just like, yeah, I'm not a big seltzer person. And he literally told me, he goes, those serving tanks that we have over there, all of those were funded by starting our seltzer program. And he goes, you might not like it, but once again, the market kind of dictates and you're constantly pivoting. What's the
Yeah.
the new biggest thing? And then I learned, about making seltzers and talk about the cost per pour and the margins in those. There's a lot of margin in it because it's corn sugar.
Yeah.
Corn sugar, some basic water chemistry. If you're going to back sweeten, your sulfates that you add to it. But other than that, the cost per pour, it's minimal and the margins are great.
Yeah, most breweries nowadays are pivoting, especially like production breweries are pivoting to the on-site experience, but also to just becoming a beverage company.
Yep.
So a lot of the larger breweries around this area, they're not only are they making seltzers, they're getting their wine license, they're getting their spirits distillation license, they're putting THC in beers. So it's becoming more of a, you have the facilities to produce large batches of drinkable medium and just make whatever is popular.
Exactly. And I've been focusing on hot water too. Just to have the non-alcoholic scene here. I don't know if it's the same down by you, but has been huge in the past 2 years. And I read a study that was off of, I believe it was the American Homebrewer Association, where they talked about in the last quarter of 2023 that they attributed about $55 million in sales nationally of hot water.
It's the
huge.
NA beer has blown up significantly in the last few years.
I don't know if this really applies to you, but how did you get feedback on your beer to help you fine tune recipes and decide on like a final menu? I know you wanted to go with, Czech lagers. I'm at the stage right now where everything I brew, I can, or I take to places and I give to people. I try not to give it to them and say, hey, I brew this, because it's very hard to get honest feedback when you're giving somebody free beer, unless it's awful. Most of the time people are going to say, oh, this is stellar, I would buy it. So we kind of do blind tastings. I'll tell the bartender or the place I go to that, hey, I'm going to bring in some beer. Would you mind serving it and seeing what people think so I can get some feedback? Did you do something like that, or?
No, and this is going to sound very conceited and egotistical, but I know what I want in beer. And so when I was trialing out recipes, I was tweaking and dialing things in, but ultimately knew what I wanted the representation of these styles to be. And so just work backwards from that to try to execute that. And that's like my advice to everybody that brews beer is like, if you want to replicate something or if you want to build something, start with the idea, like talk through it in like words, what you want the final product to be, and then work backwards from there. And then the whole like trialing beers with people and getting feedback is kind of irrelevant, because once you get on your system, like you're going to have to tweak things and build things to be a certain way, and then let sales dictate what happens. Like if you take your raspberry porter to all your friends and be like, hey, how do you like this? Oh my God, I love this. It's smoked raspberry porter. It's so good. Oh my God, I love this. And it's the worst selling beer. So it's short, outside of like technical flaws and like just being unbalanced and things like that. I think like use your intuition, obviously get feedback from people. If they like customers come in and they drink it and they're like, oh, this is, whatever. And if you're talking about like before you open, put together a game plan of what you want your beer portfolio to be, and then just do your best to execute those styles. But if somebody's like, hey, I don't like Citra hops, and you have an IPA that's a Citra IPA, I don't know what to tell you.
It is funny because there certain hops and different things, like me being a beer snob, I'll say beer scholar, let's say. I hate Idaho 7 hops. If you dry hop with them, whole different story. But if you use that as your bittering hop, very earthy, very just not a flavor I enjoy. So if I can detect, or if I see something and they list on their menu that it has Idaho 7, I avoid it. But yeah, so kind of touching on that a little bit is in terms of my mindset of beers is I like having a certain amount of staple beers, dedicating lines to your staples. I'll have a couple, lager, my Mexican honey lager or a variation of that. The Crystal Weizen, which Some beers, I don't think it needs to just be seasonal. I think you can kind of break those laws. Having a dark beer on tap, like a Guinness style of beer or the chocolate stout that I make. But then having a couple lines that will be your pilots. I don't see a lot of those with brew houses as I did 10 years ago. A lot of places don't really have a pilot that they list, or they'll do it. They'll maybe, I'm not sure what the reason is behind it. Maybe they don't want to brew a smaller batch of it. Maybe they've already gotten feedback and they decided they can bring it to scale. But I used to see a lot more of that here, where people would have, 2 or 3 lines dedicated to experimental or pilot batches, or even, nano brews that they do. And I don't really see that anymore.
Yeah, the only thing with that is it's kind of on the size system that you're talking about, it's kind of irrelevant, like
Sure.
to pilot something. I
Mm.
mean, I mean, I'll give you some rules of thumb. Smoke beers
Yeah.
don't sell.
Oh, no rust beer.
Um,
Yeah, I know.
um, Higher ABV stuff will move more slowly.
Mhm.
And the more beers that you brew, the larger your selection is, the
Yeah,
less each individual beer moves. So even if you pilot something and it takes off or whatever, and you then brew that beer and then you brew another beer that takes off or whatever, it the more options that you have will inherently reduce the volume of each individual beer. And
sure.
you'll find this out too,
Yeah,
once you get open, that like the beers you think will sell, they may sell, and then some will surprise you. But then you'll be sitting on, this hazy IPA that you think is like, oh, that's for sure going to be the number one seller, and for
yeah,
whatever reason it isn't, and then it ends up, it's 3 months old. So I mean, it's going to really come down to what customers order.
sure. No, that definitely makes sense. Um, and this might not apply to you either, is one thing I've kind of been looking at, instead of taking the full step of opening a tap room, is maybe considering doing some contract brewing, which would allow us to establish a brand, get out there, get some feedback, and then have a metric in terms of sales of what's been selling. Touching on some of the things you had mentioned earlier, is doing something like that, and working with a brewery. The only downside is that I wouldn't have a location, so I'd be losing out on some of those other factors, like the social aspect of bringing people together. But what do you think about something across those lines, about somebody doing contract brewing to establish that before doing a tap room or an actual location?
If you're just doing a tap room, I think it's irrelevant.
Okay,
I don't think that contract brewing leads to anything beneficial in the tap room space, because your tap room will dictate what you brew.
sure,
And what I mean by that is, the benefit of contract brewing is that if you're looking to distribute beer, then you can get in without
sure,
a lot of overhead, and then you can start to see if your brands take off in the market.
sure.
However, not a great business model,
Okay,
like I've already said.
yeah,
So if it's just a tap room, um, this is going to sound a little, not disparaging, but maybe kind of minimizes all the effort that we put in as brewers. But it's kind of irrelevant what you brew.
okay,
Like, if you have a lager or a blonde ale, a pale ale, a porter, kind of you hit all the notes, a hoppy, a malty, a sour, a seltzer, and you're doing what is arguably the right thing to do in a taproom setting, creating an environment for people to join and be a communal gathering space with events and all those things, people will drink the beer that's there.
sure,
And that's why I was saying earlier, like the 5 factors that
yeah,
you like, if you were to build a brewery from scratch, like what gives you the best leg up, like having the options for everybody is
sure,
important. But having the specific, like whether you dry hop with Amarillo or whether you dry hop with Idaho 7, is
mhm,
so much less important than we as brewers like to think, because nowadays, with the amount of beers that are available and the amount of breweries that are available, you're not going to the brewery down the street for their IPA that they release because they've got Amarillo in it, and then you're
yeah,
going to the other brewery because they've got like Saws or something. I don't know,
sure,
random. But you got to eat a little humble pie there, where you're like, oh
yeah,
shit, okay, just give people excellent beer
Mhm.
in a good variety that keeps them, keeps them satiated during their
Yeah.
visit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's where I'm trying to look at, and I say having your staples, having your certain styles of beer, because there have been so many places, and even one of the breweries that I worked at is you'd have people that come back the next week and, oh, do you have this one? Oh no, we ran out, but and you don't have something similar, and they came back specifically for that. And then you realize that they're not staying as long as they could have because they didn't have that one. I mean, I don't know. It's it's very difficult to assume that, obviously one beer is going to be the one beer that they come back for. But I've always thought, and I've always had the mindset that you need to have a certain amount of staples on, or a certain amount of styles on, that you're hitting as many people as possible.
Sure. And all of this advice advice, or just me ranting into the camera, whatever you want to call it, all of this sentiment is very measured and on the conservative, you know, just like the conservative end of the spectrum as far as like what breweries could and should do.
Mhm.
But having said all of those things, if a beer takes off and that becomes insanely popular, which can happen, great, ride that thing out. But generally speaking, you're going to get feedback from people all the time. Like this is a great example. My winter seasonal is the 22-degree Tamabe,
Mhm.
which is like an imperial stout version of
Yep.
the 13. The day that beer, I took it off tap so that I could put the 14 on,
Mhm.
people were like, "Oh man, I really want that beer." And then when the 14 comes on, people drink the 14 and they like it. And the day that that's off, people really want that beer. So
Yeah.
in business, scarcity is a huge factor as well. And people always want what they can't have. So
Sure.
take that with a grain of salt. You're always going to get feedback of like, man, I remember that habanero pickle sour that y'all did. That was my favorite beer,
Yeah.
but that was the slowest moving beer you
Close
ever
one.
made.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you have to take that type of feedback with a grain of salt. But if it happened to be the fastest moving beer you ever had, maybe you brew that year round.
Sure.
Consider
Yeah.
those things. But
Yeah.
the sales volume will dictate what you
Dictate what you
brew.
do.
Yeah,
Yeah. No, that's understandable. Also for you, you wear every hat. Obviously, you're the owner, proprietor, head brewer, bartender, bar manager, like everything there. Like, do you feel like you're better suited in a certain area? I know, like, from knowing previous head brewers at certain places, I know my place is kind of back of the house. I consider beer to be kind of like my baby and my creation. And if somebody, pardon my language, shits on my beer, I'm going to take offense and defend it. And I know that's not potentially the best business move, that,
yeah.
people have different opinions. And I appreciate when people have constructive criticism. But if people are going to be blunt, like, how do you feel? Have you ever experienced a situation like that where somebody dished out something that you really weren't, how did you
Yeah.
respond to that?
So I think there's a couple of questions in there, but I'll take
Sure.
the latter, the kind of like feedback part of it
Yeah.
first. Um, One of the benefits of me specializing in the beers that I do, one, I get to hone the beers and make them the best possible example of that beer that I can.
Mhm.
So I generally have very, very good feedback about my beers.
Sure.
And but what the second part of the answer is, you kind of have to, unless you're making bad beer, which is totally valid, because
Yeah.
who knows, maybe you can make bad beer and people don't like it.
Sure.
But if you're making good beer, you kind of take the hot. If you get compliments, you need to really just not care about them at all. And
Yeah.
if you get disparaging comments, short of them being like technical flaws or whatever, you also kind of have to like, you kind of need to ignore that as well, because you'll end up focusing on the wrong things, which are,
Hmm.
this person doesn't like my beer, but
Yeah.
ultimately you're brewing beer for the people. And if you make beer that is what you deem to be good quality, and 90% of the people like it, but 10% or less, like 1% of the one person comes in and writes his 3-star review on Untapped, you
Sure.
kind of just have to let that go.
Yeah.
And that's, you know, again, I'm pretty fortunate. That one of the only upsides of the business model that I created was that people seem to regard these beers much more highly because they're so specific and niche.
Sure.
But at the previous brewery that I worked at, we definitely got our fair share of like, oh, this is, oh, I got this beer. Oh, this isn't as hoppy as I thought it would be, or
Sure.
this beer is just, yeah, man, it's not great. And then you'll sometimes you'll get that 1-star review of the person's like, I only drink Bud Light. This beer sucks.
Yeah.
And you can't let that stuff affect you too much if you know that it's like not based on the merit of the actual like beer.
Sure.
Also, the
So just
service of the
execute the
beer.
beer.
Execute the beer, but then the service of it is also super important. Like you can take the most outstanding IPA and serve it in a shaker pint that's dirty to a craft beer snob, and like you lost on that transaction. That's
Yeah.
a bad move.
Yeah.
And so the service of the beer is very important.
Mhm.
So make sure that you take that into consideration as well.
No, it's good advice. I mean, I look at everything and I think to myself, obviously your bartenders, I would say your bartender is your brand ambassador. They're the last representation of the product you create, and it can be the best product in the world. But you gave it a good example is, people think pint glass is a standard pint, beer serving glass. It's not. Was never intended to serve beer, was intended to mix cocktails. So having, I don't want to be like proper glassware and all these different things you have to execute. Sometimes you're just not going to please everyone. And I have to realize that it's going to ebb and flow. I can control what I can control. I can execute what I want. We can try and establish and build a brand and build a brewery that's around as many things that we want to execute and hit the marks on. But there's going to be certain things we're going to miss on, and I just have to understand that that's just the nature of business and putting yourself out there.
Especially if you're busy. I mean, it's
God,
it's ratios, right? It's a ratio of the people that come in. If you have 10 people that come into your tap room every month, then you give them outstanding service and outstanding beer. Great, you're going to get high marks. But if you have 10,000 people coming in, there's a portion of those people that are probably not going to be super stoked. So you just got to, look at it from a ratios perspective. And then the other part of your question, I think, when you're asking like the hats that I wear all the hats in my brewery, and where do I think is my like strongest skill set? I think that just being the ambassador of this brand is my strongest skill set. Like anybody can brew these beers. I could hire and train anybody to brew this beer. I'm not like a prolific brewer or anything like that. I have a very solid fundamental understanding of how beer is made, but I could hire somebody to do that, like the physical job of brewing beer. And then, the recipes are super simple. So whatever, but I do think that recipe creation is one of my skill sets. But outside of that, like when I'm behind the bar and talking to people about the beer, I think that is definitely where I excel. Unfortunately, that's also like the lowest leverage position in the entire business. So that's another humbling aspect of it, where it's like, when somebody comes in and it's just me and them and we're talking about the beers and I'm serving them good beer at the same time, like I think that you're hard pressed to find somebody who does it better than me in my own brewery. But outside of that, does that make a great business? No.
No, but you have a customer that's really appreciative, and that's where I even joked with you, and I was like, man, I wish I would have been able to spend more time talking to you about the beer. But it's like, other things going on and all these different things. But I always appreciate, you can tell somebody who's passionate about what they do. And that was one thing that kind of stuck out, and that's why I've reached out to you, and I reach out and I gravitate towards people that are like-minded. And I'm very specific when I create beers. Like I'm very into water chemistry. I'm very into pH. Like I'm very into the technical aspect of beer. You could be super technical and make a horrible beer. But I think that lends itself well towards that, as long as you're focused on all the other components of creating a beer. And that was one of the reasons why I fell in love with brewing. is just I started making kits. I'm like, okay, the first beer I made, it was an Irish red. So not a complex beer, had some steeping grains. It was a extract kit, but I'm like, I made beer and it wasn't horrible. It wasn't a Mr. Beer kit or anything like that. But then just doing that and building upon it and the knowledge that it takes to continue. And if you want to progress anything in life, if you want to continue to learn about it and you want to, buy equipment and do these things, you still have to have it circles back to the fundamentals. But I love the fact that I'm constantly learning when brewing. It's never the same thing over and over again. I can't tell you how many different smash pale ales I've done just to learn about the different base grains and what flavor profile they lend, and learn about the different hop additions and experimental hops and what flavors and what alpha acids they give off. So I love the technical aspect of it. That might not always sell, but I think that even when doing some of the traditional styles of beer, and even though it's a much more simple recipe, that's still executing on a technical level and knowing that I put everything into it that I could still is something that I'm passionate about and I'm still driven to do. So there's a lot of beer styles I know I probably haven't brewed, and I don't know anybody who's brewed everything out there. But I like to challenge myself and continue to do things and then fall back on some of the staples. And even those, like the Mexican honey lager beer that I've done, it's I told you my wife's favorite beer. I've brewed that in so many different variations, and I finally got to the point where I'm like, okay, I'm not done with the recipe, but I feel like that's the best it's going to be in the way that I can produce it, that it's time to move to the next one. So
yeah, if you can take that same approach and apply it to business, I think that will be, which is what I'm actively trying to do in my life. But I think that will be extremely useful, because the same way that you tweak ingredients in a batch of beer, if you can apply that to the marketing or the sales of your product, or the generating foot traffic in the tap room, if you can have the same excitement about those things, I think that you can be set up for success. What often happens, and kind of happens with me at Tanglefoot, is like those things in this particular vehicle, the vehicle being the business model, tend to be things that are like focusing on things that are not the beer. And so I can sometimes get a little disheartened by that, where I'm like, this whole thing was started out of a passion for beer, and I loved all tweaking those elements and executing these specific styles and making these things happen. But when push comes to shove, the things that really need to happen in the business are like tweaking the ingredients in the actual business. And so that's just something that keep in the back of your mind, of if you get open, that there will be decisions that you have to make where you're like, oh man, I don't want to do this. But that is what is best for the business. And the beer is can often get lost in the whole scope of the business.
Yeah. When I reached out to you and sent you the email, or sent you a message on Instagram when you put out the video, kind of the mental blocks you were dealing with, I guess we call it.
Oh yeah.
And when you responded back, you're like, yeah, beer's not the most important thing in the brewery. It's a big part of it. I wasn't taken aback by that. I kind of expected that. I wasn't like, oh shit, it's not like, I kind of got it, because I've known some places where they don't do events. They didn't do food. They didn't do this. They didn't do that. They didn't have it's not just beer, it's an experience. And they didn't offer any of that. And unfortunately, those places are no longer around. So it's a great, I've got multiple beer fridges, and it's interesting to look at the stickers on the fridges of the places that aren't around anymore.
I've got some of those myself. Yeah.
And I look at it, and I'm like, man, that place their beer wasn't that great. Yeah. And then they didn't have this and didn't have that. And some of them you look at, and it's cool from a historical standpoint, but then the places that are still up there, you know the reason why they're still up there and they're still around and they're still thriving is because they've realized that and they've executed. And thank God I didn't plan to open, when COVID hit, because a lot of places went under because of that. But I mentioned Eagle Park earlier. One of the main reasons they were able to thrive is they actually switched over and they pivoted and they did hand sanitizer. And they moved to do that, and they were one of the biggest companies to have hand sanitizer during COVID. And I'm like, that's another thing to keep in mind is like, if we open a place and there's another, if we open another place and there's a pandemic, what's our business plan going to be? Because the tap room's closed. Okay, then I'm only going to do on-site retail. I'm not doing distribution. Like, what am I doing? Door-to-door sales and having a red, white, or wagon, and and doing.
Could be fun. Could be a good time.
Yeah, I'd have a couple of my own beers and then not deliver any. But no, it is really interesting to pick your brain, and sorry you're dealing with some of the struggles that you're dealing with, but I appreciate you sharing, your knowledge on and some of this stuff. And
well, yeah, man, it's been a good talk. I wish nothing but the best for you. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Yeah, I know that the starting the brewery is a whole project in itself, but as at least from my experience was like the most rewarding part was like building and getting it going. And so like, take a moment to step back and smell the roses, because it is a really fun part of the process.
It was always cool to see. I don't know how honestly, I have no idea how I came across your videos. But I would just look up home brewing and looked up different things, and I came across your video, your channel on YouTube, and just seeing the startup of, you moving around your mash tun and all your different stuff and wheeling it around. I don't know if you're still moving that or if things are fixed.
Not fixed, but not as much moving now that the barbecue restaurant closed, but yeah.
Yeah, no, I just remember seeing that. So I gravitate towards people who have dealt with quote unquote struggle and the hardships of taking a chance on themselves and taking a chance on, doing something different. So I applaud you for that. Whatever the future holds for you is, it's going to be positive. It might not be the path that you thought, but if you go into consulting or you do something different, you definitely have a mentality and an idea that you kept beer in the forefront, but you understand that there's more to it than just that. So that's always been, very, very noticeable in the videos and the content that you put out. So I think that's one of the reasons why I always saw this stuff. And when you had to dump beer, like I seriously applaud you for that. So many places, I know a couple places where they wasn't issues like that. There were ales, but they had issues with the beers, and they just changed the name of it and changed it and still put it out there. And I'm like, but that says a lot about a person and the reputation and what they're trying to do. So kudos for that.
Well, hopefully you can open your brewery and dump some beer too. That's what we all strive to do, right?
I dump small batches once in a while.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly.
Hopefully nothing, on the 3-5 barrel side, but that's what you got to do if you want to keep your reputation intact. If you have a certain standard and only you can produce that standard, you know the styles that you do, and you want to execute those to the best possible level. And if you don't, you have to step back and say, you know what, I'm not serving this. So
you got to make those calls.
Or you can serve it and get a bunch of 1-star reviews, or dig your own grave, which isn't worth it. It's better to suck it up and know that something isn't right and admit that something's not right than it is to just proceed forward and be naive.
Yeah. So. Very true. Well, thanks again, man, for jumping on here. I hope you had a good time. I know I did. And again, if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to me, and good luck on all your endeavors, man.
Awesome. Thank you, Andy.
Yeah. Have a good night. Take care. Cheers.
So that's it. That was a pretty great conversation. I really enjoyed myself. So I hope you enjoyed this. And if you got any nuggets from this, please let me know down in the comments. And if you're interested in jumping on a Zoom call to talk about your idea for opening a brewery, feel free to reach out to me at andy@tanglefootbrewing.com. I really enjoy talking through the process with people and kind of giving them insights into what it's like to actually run a brewery. So if you think that this would be beneficial to you, feel free to reach out to me. If not, hope you enjoyed the video anyways. We'll see you on the next one. Cheers.